Nosferatu, a silent film that forever changed the landscape of horror cinema. Released in 1922, this German expressionist masterpiece, directed by F.W. Murnau, introduced the world to Count Orlok, a figure whose shadowy presence and unsettling features continue to haunt audiences nearly a century later.
A Light in the Window, directed by Manuel Romero, starring Narciso Ibáñez Menta, Irma Córdoba, and Juan Carlos Thorry. Angelica, a young nurse, is hired to care for an elderly woman in an isolated and mysterious house in the countryside. However, Angelica soon becomes the victim of a nefarious plot orchestrated by the old woman's son, Dr. Herman, who suffers from acromegaly. Dr. Herman is aided by a sinister colleague and their henchmen. As the plot unfolds, a landowner and his humorous servant accidentally become involved and set out to rescue Angelica from the impending danger. Golem, directed by Julien Duvivier, starring Harry Bohr, Roger Karl, and Ferdinand Hart. Set in 16th century Prague, the Golem tells the story of Rabbi Lew, a Jewish leader who, foreseeing the persecution of his people, creates a giant clay figure known as the Golem. Using ancient mystical rituals, Rabbi Lew brings the Golem to life, intending it to protect the Jewish community from harm. However, as the Golem becomes more powerful, it begins to act on its own, leading to unintended and dangerous consequences. The creature ultimately becomes a threat, not only to the people it was meant to protect, but to everyone around it. At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul, directed by José Mojica Marans, starring José Mojica Marans. At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul follows the terrifying story of Zé do Caixão, a sadistic undertaker in a small Brazilian town. Obsessed with finding a woman to bear him a perfect son, Zé terrorizes the townspeople, committing heinous acts of violence and sacrilege. His ruthless quest leads him to murder and blasphemy, disregarding all moral and spiritual consequences. As Zé's actions become increasingly brutal, he begins to be haunted by supernatural forces, including the spirits of his victims. The film culminates in a nightmarish showdown, where Zé faces the terrifying consequences of his evil deeds. The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, directed by Edgar Neville, starring Antonio Casal and Isabel de Pomés. The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks is a Spanish fantasy horror film that follows the story of Basilio, a young and naive man who becomes entangled in a bizarre and mysterious adventure. After encountering the ghost of a murdered archaeologist, Basilio is drawn into an underground world beneath Madrid, where he discovers a hidden society of hunchbacks living in a secret labyrinthine tower. This strange community is involved in dark and supernatural activities, and Basilio must navigate the dangers of this underground world to uncover the truth behind the archaeologist's murder and stop the sinister plans of the hunchbacks. The Phantom Carriage, directed by Victor Sjöström, starring Hilda Borgström. The Phantom Carriage is a Swedish silent film directed by Victor Sjöström that tells a haunting and moralistic tale about redemption, death, and the consequences of a wasted life. The story centers around David Holm, a cruel and alcoholic man who dies on New Year's Eve. According to legend, the last person to die each year is doomed to drive the Phantom Carriage, collecting souls for death for the next year. As David takes over this grim role, he is forced to confront the pain and suffering he has caused others, particularly his estranged wife and a kind-hearted Salvation Army worker named Edith. Through a series of flashbacks, David's past is revealed, showing his descent into cruelty and his impact on those around him. Miss Christina, directed by Viorel Sergovici, starring Adrian Pintea, Mariana Buruiana, and Irina Petrescu. Miss Christina is a Romanian supernatural horror film based on a novella by Mircea Eliade. The story is set in the early 20th century and follows a young painter named Igor who travels to a remote estate with his fiancée Sanda to visit her family. Upon arrival, Igor becomes intrigued by a mysterious portrait of Sanda's aunt, Miss Christina, who died young under strange circumstances. As Igor spends more time at the estate, he begins to experience disturbing visions and supernatural occurrences, all seemingly connected to the enigmatic Miss Christina. It is revealed that Miss Christina's spirit is still present in the house, and she is determined to return to life by possessing Igor, driven by an obsessive and malevolent desire for him. The Mask, Eyes of Hell, directed by Julian Rothman, starring Paul Stevens, Claudette Nevins, Bill Walker. The Mask, Eyes of Hell is a Canadian horror film from the 1960s that blends psychological terror with surreal, nightmarish imagery. The story follows Dr. Alan Barnes, a psychiatrist who comes into possession of an ancient tribal mask. The mask is rumored to have the power to induce intense and disturbing visions in those who wear it. Curious about the mask's effects, Dr. Barnes puts it on and is immediately plunged into a series of terrifying hallucinations filled with bizarre and hellish imagery. These visions grow increasingly vivid and disturbing, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. As he becomes more obsessed with the mask, it begins to take a toll on his sanity, leading him down a path of madness and destruction. The Student of Prague, directed by Stellan Rye, Paul Wegener, starring Paul Wegener, John Gotthard, Greta Berger. Balduin, a poor student in Prague, meets a mysterious stranger, Scapinelli, who offers him a large sum of money in exchange for something from his room. Balduin agrees, and Scapinelli takes Balduin's reflection from a mirror, creating a doppelganger. With his newfound wealth, Balduin tries to win the love of Countess Margit, but his doppelganger begins to cause chaos, committing crimes and ruining Balduin's reputation. As Balduin's life spirals out of control, he becomes increasingly desperate and paranoid. In the end, Balduin confronts his doppelganger and shoots at it, only to realize that he has shot himself. As he dies, his doppelganger vanishes, symbolizing the tragic consequences of his ambition and the loss of his own soul. Dante's Inferno, directed by Francesco Bertolini, Adolfo Padovan, Giuseppe De Liguoro starring Salvatore Papa, Arturo Pirovano, Giuseppe De Liguoro, Augusto Milla. The film follows Dante, a poet lost in a dark forest who is guided by the spirit of the Roman poet Virgil. Together, they embark on a harrowing journey through the 9 circles of hell. As they descend deeper into hell, Dante witnesses the gruesome punishments endured by sinners, each corresponding to the severity and nature of their sins, from lust to treachery. The journey culminates in an encounter with Satan, trapped in ice at the center of hell. After this terrifying experience, Dante and Virgil ascend back to the surface, emerging to the sight of the stars, symbolizing hope and redemption. The film stands as a landmark in early cinema, renowned for its groundbreaking special effects and its faithful depiction of Dante's epic vision of the afterlife. V, directed by Vasily Goncharov, starring I. Langfeld, A. Platonov, V. Dalskaya. It tells the story of Koma Brut, a young seminary student who encounters a witch while traveling. After a terrifying encounter where the witch transforms into a beautiful woman before dying, Koma is summoned to a village to pray over the body of a young woman who turns out to be the same witch. For 3 consecutive nights, Koma is forced to confront supernatural horrors in a church, as the witch's corpse rises and summons evil spirits to attack him. On the final night, the witch calls forth Vi, a powerful demon. Despite his efforts to protect himself with a sacred circle, coma ultimately succumbs to the terror. Miss Christina, directed by Gerardo de Leon, Eddie Romero. Starring Francis Lederer, Greta Thyssen, Richard Durr. The film depicts a brief and simple story where a corpse, laid out in a traditional funeral setting, suddenly comes back to life. The revived body causes shock and panic among those present, leading to a chaotic and unsettling scene. The resurrection is portrayed with primitive but effective special effects for the time, capturing the audience's attention with its eerie and supernatural theme. Though the film is only a few minutes long, it is significant as one of the earliest recorded instances of Japanese horror cinema, showcasing the country's early experimentation with film as a medium for storytelling. The X-Rays, directed by George Albert Smith, starring Tom Green, Laura Bailey. The film depicts a simple scenario where a man and a woman, shown in a typical setting, suddenly have their bodies transformed into skeletons, as if viewed through an X-ray machine. This transformation is brief, and after a moment, they return to their normal appearances. The plot is minimal, focusing on the novelty of the visual effect rather than a detailed storyline. The film is significant for its pioneering use of special effects, showcasing early filmmakers' experimentation with new technology to create illusions and entertain audiences. The House of the Devil, directed by Georges Méliès, starring Jehan Dalcy. The film, which is only a few minutes long, depicts a series of supernatural events in a haunted house. It begins with two men entering a castle, only to be confronted by a variety of spooky and magical occurrences orchestrated by a devilish figure. Inside the house, objects move by themselves, skeletons appear out of thin air, and ghosts and other supernatural beings materialize to terrify the visitors. The devilish figure, likely representing Satan, conjures these apparitions and attempts to frighten or harm the intruders. The men are continuously harassed by these manifestations until they eventually flee the house in terror. The Housemaid, directed by Kim Ki-young, starring Jae-lee Eun-shim, Ju Jung-yeo, and Kim Jin-kyu. The film centers around a middle-class family who hires a young housemaid to help with household chores. Initially, the housemaid appears to be diligent and hard-working, but as she becomes more involved in the family's life, her behavior turns increasingly erratic and dangerous. The housemaid seduces the husband, Mr. Kim, leading to a secret affair that disrupts the family's harmony. As the affair continues, the housemaid's manipulative and sinister nature is revealed. She becomes increasingly unhinged, tormenting the family psychologically and physically. Her actions lead to a series of tragic events, including death and destruction within the household. The Grip, directed by Leon Bodels, starring Louis Baumeister, Kovan Sprinkhuysen. One day, Jean stumbles upon a crime scene where a wealthy man has been murdered and the culprit has fled. Despite his current state, Jean's detective instincts kick in, and he decides to pursue the case on his own, driven by a desire to clear his name and redeem himself. As he delves deeper into the investigation, Jean discovers that the crime is connected to a powerful criminal organization. Using his old skills, he outmaneuvers the criminals, eventually uncovering the truth behind the murder. The climax of the film sees Jean confronting the mastermind behind the crime, leading to a tense and dramatic showdown. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by Otis Turner, starring Hobart Bosworth, Betty Hart, Dr. Henry Jekyll, a well-respected scientist who is fascinated by the duality of human nature, the idea that every person has both a good and an evil side. Driven by this obsession, Jekyll creates a potion that can separate these two aspects of his personality. Upon drinking the potion, Dr. Jekyll transforms into Mr. Hyde, a monstrous and malevolent alter ego who embodies all of Jekyll's darker impulses. As Mr. Hyde, he commits a series of crimes and immoral acts, terrorizing the people of London. The transformations become more frequent and uncontrollable, with Mr. Hyde growing increasingly violent. Dr. Jekyll struggles with the realization that he is losing control over his darker side and the devastating consequences it brings.